as Nathan mentioned, I'm a research scientist at Google AI, just at the cusp of defending my PhD at Cornell University. And very exciting to be here virtually and tell you a little bit about the research directions we've been thinking about in the past few years. So thank you so much all for tuning in. My talk will be on insights from deep representations for machine learning systems. Okay. Great. So we have, so over the past several years, we have all been basically firsthand witnesses to just these incredible breakthroughs in machine learning. And these have spanned areas like speech recognition to problems in computer vision, classification, pose estimation, to challenging questions in natural language, things like machine translation and dialogue. And these advances have largely been driven by developments in deep learning, with these underlying deep neural network models seeing a huge amount of advances in these specific competition benchmarks. Things like ImageNet for image classification, the COCO benchmark for object detection, benchmarks in machine translation, the GLUE, SuperGLUE, and SQUAD data sets for natural language understanding. And in fact, in deep learning these days, we have so many benchmarks that there are actually entire websites dedicated to keeping track of all of these benchmarks and how some of the new algorithms and techniques we're developing are doing on them. Now, thanks to the sort of huge amount of development we've seen on these benchmarks, the past few years especially have seen the emergence of new applications of deep learning. People have been taking these advances in computer vision and natural language and looking at using these techniques to new and often specialized and quite high stakes domains, things like medicine and healthcare and even scientific discovery. And maybe one really exciting thing about these new emergent applications is that not only is there exciting research going on, but there's been a huge interest in the community in actually taking these AI and deep learning models and actually deploying them to tackle some of the core problems in this domain. Now, on the one hand, it's just been really exciting to sort of see all of this develop over the past few years. But on the other hand, to really use these systems, effectively in a safe and reliable way, we have to do a good job of bridging this kind of standard development we've had on these competition benchmarks to the kinds of models and algorithms we need to be really successful in these new specialized applications that are coming up. And sort of understanding this gap has been really sort of a core interest of mine. And so as one step towards that, we recently came out with this very thorough survey paper that really takes stock of where we are in deep learning right now in the context of what we need to do well in these new applications. And so in the survey, we try and overview the entire end-to-end process of designing and developing a new machine learning system. And we also dive into the details of some of the models, algorithms, and tasks that we've come up with, as well as lots of references for the implementation side and getting started with all of this. Now, one thing that really came out of this survey, as well as sort of other related work that we've done, is some of the considerations we need to really bridge this gap. Now, there's one set of considerations that is definitely worth mentioning, but actually not something I'm going to talk about too much, which are these domain-specific considerations. So we're going from these competition benchmarks, which might be quite generic, to these very specialized applications that have a huge amount of human expertise. And there are important questions on how much of that expertise we might want to incorporate into different parts of our system. So for instance, things like whether the predictive task is meaningfully defined, whether the important data features are actually being collected, whether there are domain-specific inductive biases in the model that might actually be worth hard coding. So these are important to bear in mind in the development, but maybe not something I'm going to talk about too much. And what I am going to focus on is some other considerations that came up when we were thinking about bridging these gaps, which are sort of important, but also fundamental machine learning considerations. And the two I really wanted to focus on, which I think are really central, are firstly, being able to go beyond performance measures. These competition benchmarks have really focused on things like accuracy metrics and sort of just pushing that up. And as we move to these specialized and high stakes domains, we need a better understanding of what our machine learning system is doing, and maybe what this might tell us about the design process, or even what's happening with the underlying data. We also need to move away from these very from these very sort of nicely curated data sets that we get in these competition benchmarks to what we have in these applications, which is often much less data because it's much more expensive to collect, maybe it's much noisier, and understand the kinds of algorithms that'll help us learn effectively in these settings. So this is what I'm going to focus on, and I'll start off by talking about going beyond performance measures. So from that kind of perspective, we can think about the gap being bridged as going from sort of the SOTA or state-of-the-art measures to getting deeper insights into our systems and maybe some interpretation for what's going on. Now, this is a very, very active research area in the field, and the community has put forward many different approaches that we can take to try and do this. So there are approaches under this umbrella of feature attribution, where we're taking individual data points and really trying to understand what the important features in that data point are. There's approaches around model inspection, which sort of takes a trained neural network model instead and really tries to dig in to understand what this model is learning. And there's also approaches on representation analysis, where we're taking both a trained model and a data set and sort of understanding how the two interface with each other in the internals of what that model is learning. And it's this approach that we've been focusing on, and I'm going to dive into this a little bit further. Okay, so representation analysis. So one thing that's very important is a big motivating factor for representation analysis is the fact that when we're faced with this task of designing a new end-to-end machine learning system for some of our new applications, it's a very challenging and complex process and can be very overwhelming. There are sort of a huge number of choices on the kinds of model we should use. There are lots of very, very important questions on what we do with our data, how we collect it, how we curate it, how we pre-process and augment it. There are questions on the training objective and regularization we might apply, and also very important questions on how learning is actually going to happen, what algorithms we're going to use, and some of the associated important hyperparameters. Now, it turns out that picking correctly amongst all of these choices is really important to having sort of a high quality, robust system. But on the other hand, unfortunately, there's very little insight guiding what a good set of these choices looks like. And so what we end up with is a design process that's laborious, computationally expensive, and opaque. And this, of course, has significant ramifications for what happens when we try and deploy these systems. For instance, a recent validation study was done on a device that relied on a deep learning model to perform skin cancer diagnosis. And what the study found is that sometimes patient images would have these surgical skin markings. And these surgical skin markings are actually evidence of a prior intervention for skin cancer. But unfortunately, the presence of these surgical skin markings had a catastrophic effect on the model accuracy. The false positive rate shot up, and the device just became completely unreliable. And we can maybe see this as a little bit of a failure in data collection and curation. Another example is given by a paper doing a validation study on a deep neural network for hip fracture detection. So here, the researchers collected a new data set and found that the model just completely failed on this new data set. Now, as we've seen, the end-to-end design process for these systems is pretty complex. So one thing they really struggled with was that there was a lot of opacity, and it was uncertain as to what was causing this model to fail. And it was only after sort of a lot of painstaking digging into the internals of this system that they found out that maybe the choice of model in the training process was leading it to overfit to certain attributes and causing it to fail on this new data set. So really, the goal of some of this representational analysis work is to try to preemptively identify and address some of these fears and do so by sort of giving us deeper insights into our system. How might we get started on this? Well, for us, one kind of motivating picture was what we just saw, the fact that we have this very complex design process for building this new machine learning system, and there's kind of little guidance on what you do for all of these choices. So what actually happens in practice if there's very little guidance on what kind of set of choices you should make? Well, what happens in practice is that people just try out a whole bunch of these different choices. So they build up this population of neural networks. Each one of these neural networks corresponds to a specific set of design choices. And then they sit there monitoring how these neural networks are doing with these accuracy and loss metrics all the way through the training process. But now these accuracy and loss metrics are precisely these kinds of performance metrics that we're trying to do better than. And in fact, they really mostly give us insights into what's happening at the very top, the output layer of these neural networks. And from getting deeper insights into our end-to-end system, this is a little bit like trying to determine the size of an iceberg just by looking at its very top. What we ideally like to do is gain deeper insights into what's happening in the hidden layers of these models. The hidden layers and hidden representations contain the bulk of the parameters. It's the bulk of where the computation and learning happens. But at the same time, these hidden representations are sort of large, they're complex, they have no nice interpretable mapping, so they're pretty challenging to analyze. And so to us, as a first question, what we wanted to try and understand is maybe how these different design choices might result in variances in these hidden representations across neural networks. And sort of breaking this down, this is really about being able to compare hidden representations in a meaningful way across neural networks. Now, this might seem like a very fundamental question, but in fact, even this question has a few layers of subtlety and complexity to it. So firstly, how do we even define a hidden representation? Normally when we're given a neural network, we think about it in terms of its learnable parameters, but actually two very different sets of parameters can actually give rise to the same kinds of hidden representations. So what do we do? And so in our work, we try to take a more direct approach. So we can kind of concretely think about feeding this neural network some input, x1, x2, x3, these images, say. And then we can just pinpoint some hidden neuron and try and see what's going on with that hidden neuron. And what's going to be happening? Well, the hidden neuron is going to be emitting some scalar values in response to all of these inputs it's seeing. And so now we can stack all of these scalar values and form what we'll call a neuron activation vector. And this neuron activation vector basically summarizes the kinds of inputs this hidden neuron is activating on and the kinds it's learning to ignore. So going back to this question of comparing hidden representations, we can think about comparing neuron activation vectors to each other. But it turns out that there's another problem. And the problem is that there's no nice alignment between hidden neurons across neural networks to really guide this comparison. And what makes it worse, maybe it's not even single hidden neurons we want to look at because they get linearly combined, and maybe it's actually a group of neurons that we should be looking at. So we call this the distributed alignment problem, and it's really central to being able to meaningfully compare hidden representations. So in our work, we propose an algorithm, SVCCA, singular vector canonical correlation analysis, that addresses some of these challenges. So the algorithm works as follows. I'll just give a quick overview. It sort of takes as input these two sets of neuron activation vectors, L1 and L2. And we can usually think of these as being two different layers in two different neural networks. Then we apply a first SVD step, singular value decomposition, that removes some directions of variance. And the output of this gets fed into a canonical correlation analysis step, which precisely deals with this distributed alignment problem. Now, the output of this is quite rich, but for our purposes, the important point is that it gives us the similarity score that tells us how similar the representations of L1 and L2 are. There's also some sort of like interesting math going on under the hood, and so just flashing it, we have this sort of cross covariance that we're dealing with that's sort of normalized, and we can kind of go through and compute this in a pretty standard way to get this similarity score. So having developed this technique that would let us meaningfully compare hidden representations, some of the first things we looked at doing with it was getting some fundamental insights into key components of the development process of our machine learning system. And one thing we've sort of seen again and again is the fact that we sort of have all of these neural networks and we're monitoring them all the way through the training process. But this monitoring is happening at the very top, the output layer. So to us, a first natural question was what's happening in the hidden layers through the training process. And it turns out there's sort of a very clear convergence pattern that these hidden layers are demonstrating. They're demonstrating this bottom-up convergence pattern where layers closer to the input are actually converging faster than layers higher up the network. Now, this turns out to be a really nice observation because it suggests a simple modification to our standard training process, which we called freeze training, where we can consecutively freeze these lower layers through the training process because they're converging. And this is sort of computationally more efficient. And we also saw some small performance improvements in some of the tests that we did and some of the work that was done actually independently to us. So this is sort of one kind of first investigation that we did. There were sort of several other questions that we investigated. For instance, studying generalization properties of neural networks. So trying to see whether networks that generalize better had certain distinguishing features in their hidden representations, and turns out they do. And so having done a bunch of these, we went ahead and sort of put the code online along with some tutorials on sort of getting started with it all. And since then, it's been really exciting to see a huge amount of follow-up work and extensions from the community at large. So there's been work on developing the main algorithm, on studying other central parts of the machine learning system development process, like optimization and learning rate analysis, looking at different neural network architectures, especially for natural language, and even some applications to healthcare and neuroscience. So this is sort of, a first summary of the kinds of things going on. And so we've sort of seen so far maybe some different ways that people can go beyond performance measures. We've dived into some of the algorithms in the representation analysis side and seen some of the insights that they can give us. And so now what's going to be nice is, so now we're going to transition from going beyond performance measures to thinking about questions around efficient learning. And actually, these kind of algorithms we've developed that'll give us insights into the internals of our system are going to be very useful in telling us what's happening with some of the popular algorithms for efficient learning. Okay, so efficient learning. So when we think about efficient learning, as sort of I'd mentioned, here the transition is really about going from this very nice curated data set, not noisy, well-balanced, all of these features, to a setting where we have less data, where maybe it's very difficult to collect labels, there's noise we have to deal with, and we have to understand what we can do here. Now, again, this has been a very, very exciting research area in the field, and there are many approaches people are taking. So one approach is actually data augmentation. And although this isn't a learning algorithmic approach, it can be very effective, especially in settings like medical imaging, where the data points you have tend to be very large. And so performing clever data augmentation on this can really help you get more out of a single data instance. It can also help significantly with challenges such as class imbalance. Another very popular set of approaches, which has been extremely popular just in the past year, are semi-supervised learning and sort of self-supervision approaches. And it's just been incredible to see how much development there has been going on. And these approaches pretty much focus on reducing the dependence on labels in your data set. And taking the medical example, this can again be very, very important because in medicine, this sort of often labels require a doctor to sit down and sort of painstakingly spend time labeling your data set, which is sort of really hard to get hold of. And then finally, there's what I'll kind of talk about, which is approaches such as transfer learning, which are all about reusing prior knowledge, and have really become very, very central to how people get started with developing machine learning models for new applications. Okay, so in this kind of efficient learning part, I'll actually sort of talk about two things, few-shot learning and transfer learning. I'll be mostly focusing on transfer learning, but just sort of give a short summary. So on the few-shot learning side, the premise is that we have lots of different tasks to learn, and maybe there's some shared similarity amongst these tasks, but we have very few data points with which to learn each task. In transfer learning, as sort of I'd mentioned, this is all about reusing prior knowledge. Now, one thing nice about sort of both of these settings is that we're actually going to see sort of the return of some of these representation analysis methods that'll give us deeper insights on what's going on and actually inform new, simpler algorithms or more flexible methods for conducting efficient learning. So like I said, the focus will be transfer learning, but I'm just going to dive straight into few-shot learning, so bear with me, and the transfer learning will be sort of a little bit more slow-paced. Okay, so few-shot learning, let's just dive straight in. So few-shot learning, it's a very central problem, and some of the most successful and popular algorithms here have been these optimization-based meta-learning algorithms. Now, there's just a huge variety of these by now, but one thing that they all share in common is this outer loop, inner loop optimization structure. And that's really been credited with their success in few-shot learning, but it also makes them pretty complex and much harder to scale to, say, larger data instances. There's also been this kind of big fundamental open question of how this outer loop, inner loop structure actually enables these algorithms to perform few-shot learning. And it's this question we try to address in our work. We put forward two hypotheses that really summarize what could be happening. And the two hypotheses are rapid learning or feature reuse. In rapid learning, the hypothesis is that the inner loop is changing the hidden representations of this machine learning system significantly but efficiently for all of these new tasks it's trying to learn. And in feature reuse, the hypothesis is the outer loop is doing most of the work. It's learning these nice abstract representations that can pretty much be reused as is for these different tasks. So this is really a question about what's happening on the internals of this system. So we went ahead and used some of these representational analysis techniques to study this, and we really managed to pinpoint feature reuse as the dominant paradigm. Now, this is really exciting because it immediately suggested a new, simpler algorithm that really reduces the complexity of these systems and has the potential to be scaled much more efficiently. And sort of as a final note, these are relatively new results, but we've sort of already seen a lot of follow-up, theoretical analysis, further study of feature reuse, and even applications to some scientific settings. Okay, so these are just some vignettes on the few-shot learning side, and now I'll spend a little bit more time on transfer learning. Okay, so transfer learning has really become almost a de facto method for getting started with training neural networks for new applications. And what is it? Well, it's really a two-step process of developing your neural network model. We start off by training on a first task, task A, that we'll call pre-training. And this kind of pre-training step leads the network to converge to a set of weights known as the pre-trained weights. And from here, we train on a second task, task B, and this is known as fine-tuning. This gives us our final model. Now, what we really care about is our performance on task B. So why perform this pre-training step? Well, it's all about sort of knowledge reuse. The hope is that if task A is diverse and complex enough, we're going to have useful knowledge and features encoded in these pre-trained weights that we can leverage to do better on task B. Okay. So transfer learning has just been kind of popular all over the place. It's been sort of standard in computer vision. People pre-train convolutional neural networks on sort of ImageNet all the time. In just the past couple of years, it's also become standard in natural language processing, specifically thanks to this paper, BERT. Actually, late last year, somebody else took some of our techniques and sort of has been studying what makes BERT so successful for transfer learning. And BERT has also found a lot of interesting applications in the scientific and biomedical side. So I've introduced transfer learning as a two-step process, pre-training followed by fine-tuning. But actually, with sort of all the resources available to us, we don't tend to perform the pre-training step. We just download a standard pre-training model, take all of it, and sort of just fine-tune this entire standard pre-trained model and sort of all of its weights. And it's this kind of little variant that's been very popular in medical imaging, where we download a standard pre-trained ImageNet model and we fine-tune on a target medical task. And we've sort of seen this across many, many different medical applications. Okay, but if we pause for a second here, there's something kind of surprising about all of this. So the whole premise of transfer learning is that we're going to have knowledge and features from our pre-training task that we can reuse for our fine-tuning task. But here, our pre-training task is ImageNet, which consists of stuff like dogs and fire trucks, and this is like not at all similar to these sort of specialized medical tasks that we're interested in. So what's really going on? And I think this underscores a broader point about transfer learning, which is that despite the fact that it's so popular, there are just many open questions on how it works. And this is especially the case in the medical setting, where there are just many fundamental questions, such as how effective are these standard ImageNet models for these medical tasks? How much are these pre-trained weights and features really being reused and sort of really where in the network? And are there even feature-independent effects of pre-training and transfer learning that we're getting? So to begin answering some of these questions, we conducted a large-scale investigation of transfer learning in the medical setting. And so we took these two large-scale medical imaging data sets, diagnosing diseases from chest x-rays and detecting diabetic retinopathy from images of the back of the eye. And we also took a whole suite of neural network models. Both these standard large ImageNet models that people love using for transfer learning, as well as a family of small, simple convolutional networks, just to sort of explore the full space. And across all of these models and across both of these tasks, we looked at training with transfer learning, pre-trained weights from ImageNet, and without transfer learning, starting straight from random initialization. This was an enormous number of experiments, but there are actually some very clear immediate takeaways. So firstly, and pretty surprisingly, transfer and random initialization actually performed similarly on most of these settings. And secondly, answering one of the questions we posed, we actually found that these simple convolutional nets were doing about as well as these standard ImageNet models across both random initialization and transfer learning. So to understand this better, we tried to dig into where meaningful feature reuse was happening in our ImageNet models. And so to do this, we turned to our representational analysis techniques. And so here on the x-axis, you're having the different layers of the network going from lower layers to higher layers. On the y-axis, you have the SVCCA similarity score. The similarity score is between when you initialize and after you finish training the network. And we do this for transfer learned networks, and we have to have random initialization sort of as a baseline. And so what we see is in the lower layers, there's this gap between random initialization and transfer. So transfer is really reusing more of its initialized pre-trained weights. But in the higher layers, this gap just disappears. And so this and other experiments really let us summarize where feature reuse was really going on based on the location of the layer in the network and even just the size of the model. Smaller models actually tend to change more than larger models. Now this kind of picture is useful because it lets us really, it sort of puts forward new hybrid approaches to transfer learning. Things such as partially reusing pre-trained weights, or even mathematically generating these lower layer filters that we'll use. And all of these hybrid approaches are important because they let us take the parts of transfer learning that are most important and then maybe redesign our architecture to be better suited to the domain we're most interested in. Finally, one place where we do see a big difference between transfer learning and random initialization is in convergence speed. And this is actually one reason why people do use transfer learning. And indeed, our hybrid approaches also let us capture some of these gains and sort of nicely interpolate this gap. But one kind of fundamental question we were interested in is sort of how much was this gain in convergence speed due to feature reuse, or were there also feature-independent effects of transfer learning? And what we found is, surprisingly, there are feature-independent effects. We came up with a new initialization, the mean var initialization, where we destroyed all of these pre-trained features, but kept the scaling of the pre-trained weights. And very surprisingly, this also gave us enormous sort of speed ups when using these. Okay, so finally, just to sort of wrap everything up, we sort of saw earlier this sort of example of this deep neural network for sort of hip fracture detection and the ways in which it was failing. This wasn't the setting that we really studied, but the kinds of techniques we've come up with, the representation analysis techniques, these deeper insights into efficient learning are sort of all very relevant for these kinds of considerations. Of course, one big struggle here was kind of the opacity of what's happening in the system, and this is precisely where techniques like SVCCA can be helpful. But perhaps most strikingly, this paper found that the choice of model and training architecture was causing it to overfit to certain attributes, and they actually went for standard ImageNet model and pre-trained weights. And this sort of really suggests that some of these hybrid approaches that give us greater flexibility and let us tune better to the domain might be really helpful in mitigating these kinds of challenges. Okay, so with that, I'd like to wrap up. Thanks everybody for listening. Huge thank you to all of my collaborators who are sort of really central in all of this work. And just want to say that, these are just sort of first steps in answering many of these important questions. And there are sort of many more open questions to explore in the future. So thank you very much.